Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Retail Doctor Group webinar State of the Nation 14, where today we're going to talk some retail strategies for getting through the current pandemic and lockdown issues. So welcome, everybody. As always, if you've got questions for any of our panelists, please put them in the Q&A section and we will ask them as we go through the session. The session will also be recorded, so if you do need to duck out early or you'd like to share it with anybody afterwards, the link will be available via the Retail Doctor Group YouTube channel later today. And there'll also be a podcast recorded, so you'll be able to find that on our podcast channel on Spotify, Android and Apple. My name is Anastasia Lloyd-Wallace. I head up the Insights Division of Retail Doctor Group, and I would like to welcome in Brian Walker, the CEO of Retail Doctor.
Good morning and thanks everyone. It's great to be here. State of the Nation 14. So we've run 13 prior and really looking at what's going on in the market, but importantly, for those who are influenced by COVID, and obviously that's many of us, what are we doing to inform our community, help our community to grow through this, and to keep everyone sort of looking to the return and the bounce back. And delighted to have Natalie Brennan, General Manager, Muffin Break, one of my clients, Carlos, CEO of Char Time, who will enter into a panel discussion shortly on some of these key trends, and then introducing you again to our stellar audience and cast of Fonteyn, Lease Info, Berlinda McPhee, HR, and Joel Hummel, who heads up Wheeler Granville. But I'll let Anastasia take care of the introductions in a more formal way. So look forward to it. Thought we'd just take a little quick snapshot to open up on a few little trends that are happening out there, which I thought was interesting. This is an interesting study that PwC do called the Pulse study. It's very consistent with what we're seeing in the IDG Insights work. What was interesting about this slide is consumers, historically, when we're working with research, of course, we're examining the opinions, behaviors, drivers, and so forth of consumers and markets. This is interesting, and it talks about how consumers see themselves changing through this period. And what we all know, of course, is the consumer shift to digital is accelerated dramatically. But what we're also finding is the growth of apps. But this whole concept of remote working, and I'm sure Belinda will touch on this, is really interesting. So here we see this data showing us increasing propensity around price orientation, consumers seeing themselves as digital, and of course the growing eco-friendly sustainability positioning. So an interesting sort of trend that we're seeing, consumers far more self-aware. Here we're seeing the use of mobiles, apps, but we're seeing lockdown exempted for a moment. We're seeing the in-store recovery in this data, but the growth in consumption on mobile phones is extraordinary. And this idea of physical and digital connectivity, this sort of agility in the way consumers move and agility in the way a retailer's brand is available to them is critical. So it just reminds us to be thinking in that way. One of the themes today is leadership through COVID. And what we saw in this data and continue to see is that working from home is getting more and more stick, as it were, more traction. And we're seeing that more work at home group, if you like, is saying that they're better health now than those who work away from home. So I'm sure Belinda will pick up on this, and I'm going to ask Carlos some questions on leadership in particular, and Natalie as well. And I think we're going to see this trend. So working from home is here to stay. According to this data, we're seeing that 43% of the survey group expect to work from home versus 21% pre-COVID. And we're seeing a satisfaction with working from home continuing to rise. So what does that mean for leaders in retail? What does that mean for retailers as well? What does it mean around the physical shopping experience? What does it mean about online research, which is increasingly high, which we all know? And what does it mean about the platform visibility as people have more time? And you've heard me say that we're spending, it's pretty well now, about 4.5 hours per day on average on our smartphones, which the previous data picks up on. We have more time to look at retailer offerings. We have more time than before, and we're less structured in that classic 9 to 5 working environment. And Simon will probably see some implications from the shopping centre perspective as well. And because our friends at Muffin Break and Chart Time are all over this, and what's interesting here is that we're seeing this decline of cooking at home because people spend more time at home. But what we're seeing is the growth of convenience. And the bottom piece was interesting around the value in Australia of estimated market revenue for ready meals and meal kits, as an example. Meal kits have grown by 50%, so that's a huge market. And those dollars, by the way, of ready meals and meal kits, 5.2 billion, is pretty well the same or a little bit over the combined revenue of Myer and David Jones. To give you a sense of scale. And the last couple of slides are really because you might recall we ran the last session on endless aisle and looking at the connectivity and interface required to set that up. And these are just a couple of little global examples from our friends at Ebeltoft, which really show this concept of mobility of physical space, such as this Louis Vuitton caravan, for want of a better term, mobile store, which actually is an endless aisle kiosk when you come inside it. And there, the whole range opens up, and they brought that into a resort town in Los Angeles, for those who can remember international travel. And a similar example at Sotheby's in New York, the Emporium. They're calling it a cross-channel retail store, but this example is again endless aisle, again facilitated for all form of devices, and certainly operating 24/7. So to set the scene, mobility, agility in mobile, consumers thinking about their way they work with retailers very differently and increasingly evolving. Retailers thinking about this space, retailers as leaders and all leaders thinking about the mobile workforce. And finally, the growth of subscription, personalization, predictive retailing, all rising to the fore and continue to evolve. So in this changing climate, delighted to introduce our speakers and hand you back to Anastasia.
Thanks, Brian. So we'll go into our first session with Natalie Brennan, who is the General Manager of Muffin Break, and also welcoming Carlos Antonius, the CEO of Chart Time, where we will talk about retail at the moment, retail leadership strategy, how to use data to really drive your decision-making during this time. So good morning, everybody.
Okay, let's go. Fantastic.
So passing to you, Brian. And then
all right. Well,
for our audience as well, any questions that you do have during this time, please put them straight in the Q&A and we will ask our panelists.
Carlos, good morning. If I start with the question about everything is quite unpredictable. You know, how do you get predictability and consistency, particularly in COVID, when there's lockdowns occurring at random notice, quick notice for that matter? You've got a workforce, you've got a network of franchisees in your business. How do you get that consistency of leadership that you achieve?
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. And it would have been great to have seen you all in person, as in the physical sense, but we continue on with these Zoom sessions. But nonetheless, look, I suppose from a Chart Time perspective, it's around adaptability. I think this time last year we were in the same position, and we've embedded a mindset shift in the organisation around being able to pivot and being agile and adapting to these environments. I think what's important from a Chart Time perspective is not losing focus on our end goal, and you spoke to that in the introduction. These turbulent times that we are dealing with, we need to navigate through, which we're doing, but not losing sight of the bigger picture, because we know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And it's keeping a focus and keeping the team aligned on what we need to deliver as a business.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of good words there. This piece around being adaptive and almost teaching and leading an environment to be culturally adaptive. And Natalie, I think that's something that I know that you do with your teams at Muffin Break. And what are some of the couple of the lessons there around keeping this adaptive workforce?
Yeah, look, when you were just talking now, and good morning, everybody, by the way. Carlos has said good morning for us both. What came into my mind straight away was control what you can control. So, you can get very hooked into catastrophizing the situation at the moment, and I think, what I learnt particularly this time last year is that this is a long game. It's a marathon. And if you are reacting and using all your energy to catastrophize, you're going to run out of energy really quickly. So look at what you can control. And my word is resilience. That's my word. The resilience around that, the bounce back around that. But also, for your teams, normalizing the situation that we're in. And I'll give you a perfect example. So I'm sure you've all got teams, COVID response teams and whatnot. And on the weekend, I'm in New South Wales, so I'm in Greater Sydney. I'm actually on the edge of an LGA in Canterbury Bankstown. Across the street from me is Canterbury Bankstown. I happen to be in Inner West, so I'm not allowed to cross the street. I have kids homeschooling, so I'm pretty busy at the moment. So Saturday comes. I'd actually prepared my team last week. I said, I think Queensland's going to go down for, some period of time. And I had a little bit of a communication with the Queenslanders on Saturday morning. And then I went and read a book. And at 6 o'clock, I turned on the news to realize that Queensland had gone into a long lockdown. Now, why I'm telling you that is that I didn't have to tell my team anything. That they moved straight into, without even telling me. We had COVID plans, we had communication, all the franchisees were told. So by the time I even knew about it, which was hours after the event, the team had already done what they needed to do. And I actually said to them on Monday morning with my team call, was telling them about how oblivious I was to this lockdown because they had just seamlessly dealt with it. And I think, and that really gave me thought for how far we've come in 12 months. That, if that had happened 12 months ago, it would have been, let's call everybody on a call, let's do this. Like, it would have been a completely different situation. And so I was not happy about normalizing COVID, but happy that the reaction to it is normalized within the culture of the team now, and they just get on with it and do what they've got to do.
Yeah, it's a great response, and I like this point around not catastrophizing. Natalie, it's really important. Carlos, picking up on that theme, how do you manage stakeholder expectations over and above staff? So there's boards, there's various stakeholders, consumers are another one, of course. How do you tend to manage that? Because that's part of that process.
Yeah, look, I think from a shareholder perspective, I think it's the monthly catch-ups and more importantly, keeping them abreast of what's happening at a local level. For the broader audience, our shareholders are based out of Taiwan. They're a 70% shareholder in the Australian business, so they're experiencing more challenges in the Asian markets compared to Australia. But there is some resilience out of the Australian market, and we're very, very fortunate and very lucky. So from a performance perspective, it's just ensuring that we're communicating that. But more importantly, I think it's again making sure that we have a continued focus on our strategic goals and our financial objectives for the end of the year. I think from a consumer perspective, I think there was a three-pronged question there, Brian. But I think from a consumer perspective, supporting them particularly through lockdowns, and that's in relation to supporting the network as well. So looking at the data, and I know that's probably a question we'll come to, but continually assessing and reviewing our data, and then deploying marketing or advertising initiatives that leverage that. So if it's around aggregator piece, then ensuring that we've got the right comms and offers in relation to that space. If it's around our loyalty data, then ensuring that our loyalty messaging from an EDM perspective is on point. So I think it's just continually assessing and looking at the data. We've got so much data available to us now because we've got so many different channels of communication and points with our consumers. And then assessing and delivering our advertising messages to that.
Yeah, it's a great answer. And before I turn back to Natalie, where you're also taking this conversation in my mind is the piece around what are the opportunities here? this lovely piece where it's almost the Simon Sinek saying, okay, how can we do this differently, or why? And I know that the business, and we're obviously close to you, spend considerable resource thinking around how do we do this differently? Where is the opportunity here?
Every day. I think Natalie would be the same too. And I think it's regardless of the environment that we currently are all dealing with, it's how do we continue to look at our business and how do we solve not necessarily complex business solutions. I mean, we're a simple business at the end of the day. We sell iced tea or bubble tea. But it's looking about how we can do things differently. And that's, part of that's also around the central support team and our business partner network being part of the broader conversation around how we're performing and what are the areas of opportunity that we can potentially challenge ourselves to do things differently. So a lot of people in the business will have opinions and they're valid, but more important, it's about looking at the data and then identifying where are those opportunities. So to give an example of doing things a little differently. So we know, and you in one of the slides there, you spoke about the digital change, and that's been ongoing for quite some time. I've previously spoken about the level of investment we have from a digital perspective, particularly around our loyalty database, and that continues to grow. We're forecast to achieve in excess of 1 million database members by the end of this calendar year, so very sizable database. But more importantly, that's one channel of communicating and engaging from a transaction perspective with our consumers, and so there's very rich data in that. But the other aspect is looking at how we, in this contactless environment, using other methods to engage with our consumers in a bricks and mortar environment. QR codes is one method that we're using, where consumers don't need to download the app and become a member, so they can transact quite quickly without having to engage with a staff member. And the other aspect is kiosk hardware technology, which we've now been rolling out for about 2 years. What's interesting about those three different consumer touch points or transaction points is that looking at the data, we know which ones perform better, and then looking at that data to then identify how can we change the customer experience in those spaces to then drive a better return from our retail metrics around our ATV, USP, etc. To give you an example, we opened our latest Chatime Tea Brewery in Karrinyup in WA last week. We have 3 dedicated touchscreen kiosks in that location. 98% of our transactions in that environment are through kiosks. Why is that important? One, there's an efficiency perspective from a labour perspective around staffing, which is great. So it's great for the business. But more importantly, we get a higher ATV out of the digital spec than engaging with a staff member. So there's an enhanced user experience. There's a commercial upside to the business, not just from the ATV, the higher ATV, but more importantly, there's also an efficiency cost in relation to training of staff, particularly when you're dealing in an F&B environment where casual staff are in and out every sort of 6, 12, 18 months. So, so looking at those opportunities and looking at those metrics and continuing to hone those.
Yeah, I think, we know this firsthand, the work you're doing in this space. And what I also like, and Natalie, I'll turn to you because I know you're strong in this space as well, is thinking about how do we look outside the tunnel that's created versus the inward-looking leader. And I know as a leader, you're always thinking about how do we do this differently? What are our opportunities here? How do you infuse that culture internally that people look outside, take advice, use data and so forth, and think their way through these opportunities?
Yeah, I was thinking, as Carlos was talking, I was thinking about the number of sacred cows I've been able to burn in the last 12 months. And that's because, this having to look differently at everything has allowed me to change things that the company never would have allowed me to change. And it's funny, you talk about QR codes, Carlos, again, as I was talking, we flog QR codes to death pre-COVID. Now it's like a key part of our communication tool. We do a calendar every year which we give to our customers, and it's got muffin recipes on each of those pages. Well, we've put a QR code and we're putting videos. So now when the customer has the calendar on the fridge, something that's very tangible, and they want to make that recipe, they can QR code, and we're going to have team members explaining to them the tips and tricks, and so you're engaging with your customers in such a different way now.
Yeah, I think that's the point.
But just how do I do it? How do all these ideas come? And I'll put a shout out to myself and just say, this is the third year that the Australian Financial Review has named Muffin Break as the most innovative company, top 10 in the country. So how do we keep hitting that target? And it's really about empowerment for your staff, and I know that sounds like a buzzword, it's like, oh yes, I empower my staff. Okay, what do you actually do? You actually allow them to fail is really the key to it. And again, much easier to say than allow them to do it, because, particularly in a really difficult year, a failure probably is exacerbated more than ever. But when you make that failure bigger than what it is, it stops growth and innovation. So, and I know Brian's heard me say it, that's why he said, I know Natalie says, I say to my team, you only need to be right. You need to be right 80% of the time, 80%. So it gives them kind of the space to go, oh, well, I can fail 20% of the time. Now, they don't fail 20% of the time. They fail very, very rarely. But what it does is it allows them to take accountability. It allows that innovation. It allows them to take risk. It allows them to think differently. And that's where all the innovation comes out for us. So whether you're talking QR codes or virtual reality, or as Carlos is saying, kiosks, different ways to do things. So that's my tip.
It's a great tip. And also sitting in there is this nice little piece about doing it differently. And if I think about your example of the QR code on the fridge door, and there I am going to your business, not as a reseller, if you like, of finished product, but an expert. Yeah. Yes. And that expert positioning is critical to this evolution and doing things differently as well, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting you talk about meal kits. I just wrote it. I know it's not in any of the questions, but top of mind for me, because one of the sacred cows that I've burnt in the last 12 months is online sales. And we were able to pivot our franchisees and our own business into what I call meal kits, which was basically muffin mix with a few chopped chips and a bit of decoration. And it went through the roof, and we sold them at store level and online. And so absolutely, I would concur that this idea of they don't want to bake the whole thing. They just want a shortcut. And that's where you kind of have this meal kit. And, one of the things we're working on at the moment is the expansion of that range ready for Christmas, because you're absolutely right. No one wants to make a banana bread anymore. But guess what? I'm going to have a muffin break banana bread mix for you by Christmas, Brian. So you can just add it and make it.
I'll be there for sure. And Carlos, great answer, Natalie. Carlos, the piece that's intriguing here is we're starting to really think about alternate revenue streams, strategy, and the rise of brand. So in the last while, we always talk about channels, don't we? But of course, channels become increasingly less critical as does the rise of brand and the way that the brand permeates into consumers' lifestyles. And Carlos, I know you and Natalie have been doing good work in this space on insights, driving strategy. How important is that in your thinking?
I'll look without the insights, whether it be from a consumer perspective, whether it be from a business perspective, we wouldn't be able to make the informed decisions. As much as instinct plays a big part in business, particularly for those people like Natalie and I have been in franchising for a long, long time, given the particularly my grey head. We need that data to back up those decisions. But continuing to look, so the power of the brand. So we're 12 years in the Australian market now, the Fonteyn brand, and we've had reasonable success, and aspiring to continue to be the leader in the category, because we're far from being the leader. We continue to look at how do we maximise or optimise the brand investment today. So not too dissimilar to Nat's example around the do-it-yourself kit example. We have finally, after quite some work and investment, about to deploy into one of Australia's largest supermarket chains in October this year, a do-it-yourself kit. That's on the back of the success of the Chatime brand from a bricks and mortar perspective, but more importantly, opening up additional sales channel opportunities for the franchisor, but also for the franchisees. So they're able to sell those products in their tea breweries at a higher margin, given they don't take the same margin as cut as a supermarket, but then opening up a different user occasion. What's great about that opportunity, it dovetails back into the tea brewery. So what do I mean by that? So every box, every sachet in those do-it-yourself kits has QR codes linking back to download the loyalty app and get your first discounted drink in the tea brewery. So we're building that ecosystem where consumers will circle in and around the brand at different touch points. But more importantly, we can use that data about identifying where are the additional opportunities for bricks and mortar locations that potentially haven't been identified in the traditional network investment research work that we would do around our development runways. So we're looking forward to launching that in October this year and then reviewing that data early next year.
It's a really good example, Carlos, of using the brand in terms of searching out new markets, being relevant, increasingly finding new consumers, as well as giving you great intel through the journey of the product. It's also a great example of looking for alternate revenue streams, thinking through strategy, and not just doing what we've always done. And also I trust Simon will touch on this too. It also speaks to me about a slightly lower reliance on the physical space, but an integration of all these variables, and therefore less reliance on landlords, less reliance on the way that we did it in years preceding, much more of an omni-channel positioning. Anastasia, how are we going for time?
We are good, Brian. We've probably got about five more minutes there.
Okay.
So if we've got any questions from the audience, if you'd like to pop them in for Natalie and Carlos now, and maybe if you've got one or two more questions, Brian, and then I'll bring any audience questions in.
And so, thank you, Anastasia. So, Natalie, what have you learnt in the last lockdown to this lockdown in New South Wales and, Victoria, Queensland, and so forth?
Differently?
Yeah, differently.
Look, I think, I think, and I talked about it before, just being able to deal in the unknown. The other thing too, particularly with this New South Wales lockdown, which is a little bit different for us, given that one is we have teams all around Australia. So at different times, each of those teams have been affected differently. And obviously Victorians specifically I'm talking about. But for the Sydney head office, if I say that, we really haven't experienced till this lockdown, what has happened around the rest of the country. We won't talk about WA. They don't even know there's a pandemic over there. But the thing about it is, don't get into a mindset that it's going to end at a certain date. And I'm being very philosophical here. I'm trying to channel Viktor Frankl, and for all of you that know that book about
the Stoics survive.
Correct, that's right. So when we went into this lockdown in New South Wales, I said to my team, prepare that we will be in lockdown till the next school holidays, which is 11 weeks and probably 13 if you add the school holidays. I told them that in week 1 and they were like, what are you talking about? She shut us down for 2 weeks. Because the way that this lockdown was happening, we were shut down for a week and then another week. And it was kind of like, it was like death with 100 cuts. So very early on, I set the team up to understand that this was going to go on a long time. Now, if it doesn't, great. And that's a bonus. But when you set your team up, it's going to be okay next Monday. And that's the thing that this lockdown is very different to last year, is this kind of ongoing pain. So let's deal with the pain in a whole. Let's get some strategies going. Let's deal with the franchisees in particular, get their mindset right that this is going to go on. And as I said, anything less than that is a bonus. And that then gets, so when we've been extended, again, my team, it's just been like, yep, we know what to do. Because I think if you're relying on, you know, you know, something to happen next week, you know, even when you're all planning for, you know, Christmas at the moment, you know, planning and saying we're going to be vaccinated by November, I think is a foolish way to go about it at this point, because there's no guarantee for that. So plan your contingencies around that. And that's what I have. So we have a plan if all goes well, but we also have a plan if it doesn't go well. And so then it's no surprise if it doesn't go well.
Yeah. And Natalie, and I'll pass to Carlos as well on the same question. You've got networks of franchisees. Some of them sail pretty close to the wind in terms of their finances for whatever reason. And when a leader turns around and says to the network, effectively plan for this to be longer, and you're keeping a close eye on vaccine rates and so forth, vaccination rates, how do you support a network of operators, some of who may not be able to survive that 12-week window?
I think Nat nailed it. You know, for me in the business, you know, when any of the team use the word hope, I say hope's not a word we use in our business. It's either we have a strategy, because hope, it's not a plan. Okay, and I think Natalie's bang on. It's we've got to stay focused on what we need to deliver with the business, and what we're going through is just a normality in business in the current environment. It's just part of doing business. In relation to supporting business partners, we have more frequent network health reviews where we're looking at all the data, whether it be from their deputy rosters, whether it be their sales, their cost of occupancy, etc. So we've got a pretty clear indication of where the pain points are for a portion of the network. We're providing, of course, relief, whether it be from a royalty perspective, extended payment terms, and where we need to, we are providing short-term loan arrangements. So we're fortunate we're in a position that we can access very cheap funding off our internationally. So we can provide those loans to our business partners so they can get through the next sort of 12 to 18 months. So, but more importantly, it's ensuring that there's strong lines of communication with our field-based team. They are the conduit between us and the central support team. It's staying close to cash flow forecasts, staying close to their financials, and I suppose one of the learnings I think for us as a business where we are this year versus where we were last year is that we potentially made some poor decisions last year as a business where we let some key personnel go for various reasons in relation to managing costs in the business. But upon reflection, and you know, would I have changed that? I potentially would have. I think it put us in a very difficult position in relation to supporting the network, and so we've made a very wise decision this year to continue and manage the business with the resourcing levels that we have, so that we can provide the levels of support that the network need on the basis that as soon as we come out of this situation, our business will be better for it. So rather than retreating, we're taking the COVID aspect head on.
Yeah, I think there's a lovely piece around leadership here, and I can't think of the author is, but it's this piece around where they zag, we zig. You know, it's this idea of looking at it in a counter-cyclical way, and as you rightfully say, keeping those teams that are proven performers together. And I think in passing, Natalie, before I hand back to Anastasia, would you agree about keeping that team, the A team, close?
Yeah, it's when, you know, when I was thinking about this question, what would you do differently? My answer is exactly the same. We stood down 90% of our staff for 3 months. And, you know, there was a lot of stuff I did to keep that team connected. But in hindsight, and again, you know, we did it when we didn't know about JobKeeper and all the rest of it. But I should have just kept that team on 1-2 days a week, because although they will be moving slower, they would still be moving. And when we came out of that 3 months, the energy I had to do to get the team going again, and then we have not done it again. So we've stood down nobody, we've made no more redundancies, we've kept the team that came out, which I will tell you was 5th of July, because, you know, that was D-Day for me, is the same team I have today. And in fact, I've lost one person in the team since then who's gone on to another job. So that team has stayed solid. And when I'm trying to pivot right now, that's been my, that's my secret weapon. I have a team that's solid and I can move fast.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pass back to Anastasia, but I'll make a comment. Belinda, who's an expert in HR, I'm sure you'll pick up on this piece around the team. Carlos and Natalie, what can I say? If you're in the business of leading teams through this environment and you didn't hear some wonderful insights, you weren't really listening. They were fantastic. So thank you both, and I'll pass to Anastasia.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, and we've got a quiet audience today. I think it's the largest audience we've had in attendance so far this year, but they're all very quiet, so we've got no further questions. But I'm sure if there is anything, Natalie and Carlos, if people want to connect with you on LinkedIn, I'm sure you're more than happy for them to add you on LinkedIn and send a quick message. But fantastic, yeah, a lot of insights there. I think that's probably what it is. I think you've probably answered all the questions everyone was thinking, because every time I thought of one, the answer then came up in the conversation. So that's been great. Thank you so much. And so we will, as a reminder for the audience, everything is recorded. So if you do want to listen again or share with anyone on your team, there'll be a podcast link and a YouTube link at the end of the session. And now we will pass to Berlinda, who will talk on HR matters for us. So Berlinda, if we will welcome you. Berlinda is from Track HR Consulting, and I will just return back to our presentation. So fantastic. So welcome, Berlinda.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Anastasia, and thanks, Carlos and Natalie. That was a fantastic presentation and some very salient points around team and leadership, which I'll touch on towards the end of the presentation. And just Brian was talking about working from home and flexible working arrangements, so I might just touch on that before I get into the presentation. It's actually quite fascinating through the recruitment process over the last few months, particularly with the roles that are, more support office-based roles compared to obviously stores roles where there's less ability to work from home, but it's becoming now an essential criteria for a lot of people. So a lot of people won't even, have discussions for senior opportunities unless there is the ability to work flexibly. So the hybrid working model that we've spoken about before is absolutely here to stay. All of the trends overseas in the US, they're all about to go back to work for Labor Day, obviously having their extended lockdown. People are actually exiting the workforce or are exiting jobs, and they're calling it the Great Resignation in the US in terms of the high staff turnover trends. And we did see a little bit of that in Australia, obviously sort of up to about June. But certainly the requirement for flexible working arrangements is a given. It's here to stay. It's certainly not going away anywhere. And businesses just need to learn how to adapt to that and make sure face-to-face time is all around, collaboration and when people need to be together, and allow for, the quieter, more individual work to be done from home. And then obviously, making arrangements along the way for other types of work. So just touching on that, and thanks, Brian, for flagging that. What I thought I'd do, just cover off some of the more factual pieces of information, and I'll quickly go through these. Obviously, as we're all aware, JobKeeper was not resurrected, as many people thought what may be the case. And so what the federal government and the state governments have come up with, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, is the COVID-19 disaster payment. So that disaster payment was originally for New South Wales. It has been extended to also include Victoria, South Australia and Queensland. And it's for those markets that are in lockdown. So the difference this time with the COVID disaster payments is the employer is taken out of the loop, and that the team member that is impacted goes directly to Services Australia to make an application for the COVID disaster payment. And there's two tiers and level of payment. There's the payment of $750 per week for those people that have lost 20 hours or more, or there's a payment of $450 a week for those that have lost between 8 to 20 hours. So again, it's a process that the team member registers themselves with Services Australia. If they're on some other welfare benefits, there's a top up that they can also claim as a part of this payment. And the payments become recurring through Services Australia as long as the recipient is obviously approved and as long as the declared hotspot and lockdown restrictions are in place. So for anyone who has team members that have lost hours, that are, stood down, because you can stand people down, as we know, under Section 524 of the Fair Work Act, that you can certainly direct them to Services Australia and provide as much information as possible to help them manage through this COVID disaster payment process, which they will need to go through themselves. So I just thought I would touch on that in case anyone's not aware of that. And then in terms of all of the restrictions, so I think it would be safe to say there's been a lot of confusion, and Natalie talked about it before. If we had to wait for every time the government made a decision on how to run our businesses, that would be very, very disruptive. But the reality is we do need to check the restrictions on a regular basis, and we're certainly checking them every state on a daily basis. So as most of you would be aware, Greater Sydney's in lockdown until the 28th of August. And there's obviously, certain rules around what you can and can't do depending on which LGA you live in. So we might just move on to the next slide, Anastasia. So I think the key thing that most people are confused about is this definition of what's called an authorised worker. So you might have heard Gladys come out and declare that every job in New South Wales is an essential job. So there's different terminologies used for different classification of workers across each of the states, which is quite confusing. But under New South Wales, every role is considered an essential role. The difference is there is this definition called authorised worker, and authorised worker only applies to what's called the LGAs of high concern. And currently in New South Wales, those 8 LGAs are Fairfield, Canterbury Bankstown, Liverpool, Campbelltown, Cumberland, Blacktown, Parramatta, and the Georges River. There is some speculation that that could be expanded to some of the other LGAs around those surrounding suburbs. But as of this morning, they were the updates. And for those team members that are deemed to be authorised workers in those LGAs, they're the group that are only allowed to leave, obviously, their LGAs to go to work. Naturally, they can work within their LGAs, but that's when they need to meet the definition of what the government deems to be an authorised worker to be able to do work outside of their LGA. So I just wanted to touch on that because there is a little bit of confusion on that. There's also a little bit of confusion on what the current COVID testing requirements are in New South Wales. So previously, when the COVID testing requirements were released a few weeks ago, it was only the Fairfield area as an LGA of high concern that had to have their workers tested every 72 hours to enable them to go to work. And the ruling at the time was that the team member had to show a negative test result before they could actually go back to work. Now, as we know, there's a delay in COVID test results, regrettably, in terms of by the time someone gets tested and by the time they get their test results back. So this advice has been updated by the government. So the new requirement now is that workers within the Canterbury Bankstown LGA do need to be tested every 72 hours. And also in Cumberland and Fairfield, the rules have been changed that testing is only required for aged care and health workers only. And so what the testing requirements are, as I mentioned, you need to be tested once every 72 hours to be able to go to work. And the change of proof of COVID test evidence is that you must obviously show that you've actually had the COVID test by having either an email or SMS, text message to be shown if you're pulled over or if your employer asks you, and that you actually can go to work, obviously, whilst your test results are still coming back. But naturally, if it's a negative test result, you must self-isolate and you can't go to work. So that's just a little bit of an update on the current testing requirements, because it is quite confusing and it does change. So it's important to regularly monitor and watch this space in terms of what those requirements are. And in terms of the rest of ANZ, in terms of what's happening, we know that the Vic restrictions were thankfully lifted on the 27th of July. So mandatory mask wearing is still obviously required in Victoria. South Australia restrictions were lifted. They're now on level 3, which is medium restrictions. So they've got all the usual things around social distancing, mask wearing, etc. WA, which was mentioned before, they're at a lower level of restrictions. So they've just got their, watch and act state of emergency, low level restrictions in place, as do Tasmania, as do the Northern Territory. And New Zealand, thankfully, is on alert level 1, which is their lowest level of restrictions. So that's what's happening around other parts. Queensland, as we know, as Natalie mentioned, went into extended lockdown initially just until Tuesday. That's now been extended until Sunday afternoon and is most likely going to continue beyond that, just for the LGAs across southeast Queensland. The ruling there is that non-essential businesses must close. And interestingly, retail stores have been identified as not being restricted, but there also obviously there's some confusion around, there's obviously the stay-at-home orders and you can only leave home for the key 5 reasons. But at the moment, the advice from the Queensland government is that retail stores are not identified as restricted. So that's just to give you an update on what's happening in Queensland. Another big point of contention and questioning that I've been getting is around how do we deal with vaccination? So what can we tell our staff? Can we mandate our staff to get vaccinated? What can we say? What can't we say? What can we do? What can't we do? And it's a bit of a minefield. So just to give you some high level messaging and recommendations, naturally the Australian government and all of the state governments are encouraging all eligible team members to be encouraged to be vaccinated in line with the advice and the recommendations from the Australian government, and naturally for their own individual health circumstance on the advice of a health practitioner. So the key messaging that is being encouraged by companies is for businesses to highlight the importance for staff members to get a COVID vaccine. Under TGA rules, you can't actually say, go and get AstraZeneca or go and get Pfizer. You have to be neutral around just encouraging to get a COVID vaccine. And also, the messaging around that getting a vaccine, not only protects yourself and your loved ones, but also, supports the community and will ultimately help the Australian economy recover and allow us to, not endure continuous lockdowns and, get to a point where we can, come to our new normal of just dealing with the virus. So what's important for you to do if you're encouraging staff to get vaccinated is to encourage and refer staff to the Department of Health website eligibility checker. So I've included the link there so team members can obviously check what they can and can't do in terms of their own eligibility status. Some businesses and some organisations and industry sectors are considered, higher risk, so they get priority in terms of vaccination, which is terrific. And the other important thing is the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods organisation, obviously has very good, clear messaging around what you can and can't say in terms of vaccination, and also what you can and can't do to encourage people. So from a financial inducement perspective, you can encourage people to get vaccination. You can encourage people by giving them time off to get vaccination, but you can't pay them with certain inducements such as alcohol and tobacco, but you can obviously consider other ways of encouraging people to get vaccinations. And last but not least, a lot of businesses have asked, can we actually find out the vaccination status of our staff? And the short answer is people can voluntarily provide that information, but under privacy considerations, you can't actually require someone to openly discuss and declare at the moment their vaccination status. And of course, government rulings might change on that, but that's the current update in terms of what you can and can't do in terms of dealing with vaccinations. Just some general employment relations updates that I thought would be good to let you know. There's usually always around end of June, July, lots of updates from an employment relations perspective. So under the General Retail Industry Award, there was a change at the end of June around allowing more flexibility for part-time employees. And this ruling came into effect at 1 July, and some businesses aren't aware of that. And essentially, it makes it a lot easier for businesses to increase the hours for their part-time team members by doing that by text, email, or other electronic methods. Under the previous rulings under the award, it had to be a much more slower, more manual process. So Fair Work is just coming, more contemporary in terms of how it's recommending communicating with staff. And then the other key ruling for you to be aware of is that the new ruling is also that part-time workers who work additional hours can actually have their hours they can request for them to be reviewed if there's a regular and systematic increase of their hours, because obviously their accruals are based on the hours that they work. And if they're regularly being flexed up, the Fair Work Commission believe that it would be reasonable to reassess their hours with the view that, if it's possible for the business and reasonable, that they should have their core hours extended if they're regularly being asked to work increased part-time hours. So that's just something for you to be aware of from a compliance perspective. We also will have an annual wage increase for the General Retail Industry Award on the 1st of September. So the Fair Work Commission announced all the 2.5% minimum award increases that were effective for the majority of modern awards on the 1st of July. But because retail has been doing it tough, that delay of increase was pushed back to 1 September, and super high risk industries like airlines, hospitality, etc., their increases have been pushed out to November. Something else for you to be aware, the high income threshold for unfair dismissal claims has also been increased as of 1 July to 158,500. And also there's been some helpful changes to the Migrations Act as it relates to temporary visa holders, because there's obviously a shortage of talent in Australia, and particularly for frontline retail roles. A lot of recruitment activities that I've been involved in with my team, a lot of conversations with people that would typically be candidates for frontline retail roles is they're deciding that retail may not be the career option for them because of the stop-start nature of, reduced hours, stand down, etc. over time. So there are people taking themselves out of the industry. So the government has looked at, ways of loosening some of the restrictions around temporary visa holders to make it easier to obviously utilise some of those visa holder changes to allow people to employ others. Some other updates to be aware of: the wage theft is now a crime in Victoria. So that came into effect 1 July. So there's quite severe penalties and jail terms for those that breach those rulings. So just something for you to be aware of. And then again, the Fair Work Act changed again on 1 July to increase a whole raft of changes around how agreement processes would work to make that more simpler between employers and employers. The whole new casual conversion rules, which you should familiarise yourself with. So if casuals work regular and systematic patterns of work for 12 months, they can request permanency. So something that you need to check at a 12-month mark. And then there's also rules around flexible working arrangements, and as I talked about, the part-time working arrangements. So that's just some things for you to be aware of. Again, over the ditch in New Zealand, there were some changes to the Sick Leave Act under the Holidays Amendment Bill, which was effective on the 24th of July. So if any of you have businesses in New Zealand, you need to be aware that your sick leave provisions needed to have increased on the 24th of July to 10 days per anniversary date. And then there's also some pending legislative changes that will come up in New Zealand at the end of the year around what's called the Fair Pay Agreement legislation to look at minimum entitlements, and a further review of the Annual Holidays Act. So I won't talk any more about that because it's subject to debate in Parliament, and as those become legislation, we'll share those with you. In terms of general employment trends, so again, we had some discussions earlier about leadership trends, but the key trends around engagement. Gallup did a global research piece of work a few months ago around global engagement trends. Australia, not surprisingly, is one of the highest engaged workforces internationally due to, again, our positivity around work and how our community has dealt with COVID up until now. But the key trends that are still coming out is that safety and security are critically important for team members. So they want to feel that you're caring for them, that you're keeping them safe, that you're keeping them secure, and that there's that trusting relationship that you have with your team members. Critically important. And to some of the discussion that Natalie was talking about before, from a communication perspective and from a leadership perspective, it's critically important to keep engaging, talking and listening to your workforce in terms of, credibility around messaging from leaders, in terms of, genuine two-way communication, making sure that it's personable, feasible and sustainable from a communication perspective. And again, in terms of leadership, just, key tips around how do we keep people engaged is listening, making sure that inspiration and plan and hopefulness continues, because that it obviously engages people. And again, create a guiding set of principles around how we're going to maneuver through all of these processes. They're the key learnings. And again, I know it's been difficult for everyone and we wish you all the best, but we'll move through all of this, and we're confident that, again, by monitoring and watching what's going on, we'll just take each day as it comes and work to our plan and get through these difficult times. So I hope that's helpful, and thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Belinda. Fantastic. A lot going on there for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Belinda. That was a really great overview of all that is going on, and the points you continue to resonate with the themes and the speakers. So great content as ever. Anastasia, I think we'll hear from Simon. Is that?
We will. So we now pass to Simon, CEO of Lease Info, to give us an update on property and leasing. Thanks, Simon.
So, Simon, you're right in the coal face of rental negotiations. All the retailers out there. What's going on out there?
Thanks, Brian and Anastasia. And before I start, I'd like to say what a fantastic set of presentations we've had. Particularly in the management of Muffin Break and Carlos. It's very inspiring, and I got a lot out of it just listening to how you're dealing with. You're running your organisations. So really well done there. And also Belinda, some excellent HR advice. Obviously, everyone who's running a business, regardless of what industry it's in, is still going through these issues. So, they're universal. So very well done. And I got a lot out of it. And I'm sure everyone on the team, on the discussion will as well. So, my talk today will be around an update on what's happening with the state-based legislation, and then I'm going to do a vox pop, which is what's happening on the street in terms of what are retailers and landlords talking about, and then I'm going to do one particular court case which is very relevant at the moment, and then I'll hand back to Anastasia. So at a philosophical level, there's an old saying that you can't enter the same river twice. And that's very true for dealing with this lockdown. So some of the legislation that was around under the code has been revamped, particularly in Victoria, but the majority of state governments are bringing in different rules, and New South Wales will start there. They have brought in a kind of no eviction rule without first receiving a mediation certificate. So that really means that if your tenant's in breach as a result of their lockdown, and it's in those dates, 13th of July to 28th of August, and they're an impacted lessee, so as per what I have there on that list, and the tenant can prove that they're an impacted lessee, and note the onus is on the tenant, not the landlord, to prove it, then they must go to formal mediation. The difference here is that landlords are not obliged to waive or defer rent, unlike what we had in the previous lockdown and previous rules. So New South Wales is basically formal mediation, no lockouts. So that's a departure from last time. However, Victoria, if you move to the next slide, Victoria has revamped a form of the old commercial leasing code of conduct, which your panel will be familiar with, which is rent relief is to be proportionate to the tenant's drop in turnover pre-pandemic. So by way of example, if the turnover drops by 50%, then in that month, then 25% of the rent needs to be waived and 25% deferred. There's also provisions where the tenant can seek mediation through VSBC. There's been no change to the eviction rules, and land tax relief is available for landlords who are providing rent relief in accordance with this scheme. South Australia has a similar set of rules to New South Wales. However, they have brought in a couple of other things, which is you're not allowed to increase the rent during the lockdown, and the lessor is not allowed to on-charge land tax if there's a COVID-19 tenant in hardship. So those things are unique to South Australia, but they also don't have a waive or defer scheme at the time. And similar to Victoria, they've got a landlord land tax relief package available. At the moment, there's been no change to WA, ACT, NT, and I'd be surprised if there was, but obviously this is a fast-moving pandemic, and if they go back into those states go back into lockdown, and they may bring back some form of change. So that's that in terms of the legislation. But I guess what a lot of people want to hear about is what's actually happening on the street. And, that's where, I'm involved. A lot of the retailers and the landlords are also involved. And a number of high-profile retailers have already come out, and particularly, Accent Group, Best and Less, they've been quoted in the paper that they're calling for mandatory COVID-19 lockdown clauses to be included in all current and future leases. And what that really means is that given that the possibility of lockdowns in the future seems high, given that we don't know what sort of variants are coming down the track, that there is provisions within an existing contract to deal with this without having to rely on state-based legislation. And some landlords are actually starting to come around to this idea that there are provisions. Obviously, there are legal principles around what landlords and tenants have to comply with. Landlords have to provide a quiet enjoyment, safe working environments. Tenants have to pay the rent, but only on the basis that they're able to get the foot traffic within a shopping centre that they rely on to do their business. So that's an interesting provision. The other thing that I think will possibly happen in the future is that state governments may update their Retail Leases Act to provide for this. So obviously the bigger landlords would have these sort of clauses or contemplate these clauses, but the small strip retailers would probably, and landlords would not have. So the state governments may well bring in their own form of future mandated COVID lockdown provisions. The federal government's also considering extending insolvency protection laws for SMEs. Why is that relevant for leasing? Because obviously a tenant can't trade and keep their provisions going if they're insolvent. And if if the tenant's trading insolvent, then they're potentially could be repudiating their lease. So that's an important provision. The other thing that's very important is what I'm hearing, and I'm actually seeing it myself, is that a number of landlords have started to move to help their retailers outside of Victorian legislation. So the landlords are actively aware that, you know, a lot of tenants are in financial distress, and they're starting to move ahead of any legislative change, even though they're not required to do so. And I think that's good practice in terms of what we've heard of from the previous leadership team. You need to have sound principles of, you know, a plan, so that when we emerge, and what we know is that when we do emerge from lockdown, there is definitely a bounce, and retailers are able to pick up, start trading again actively, and start getting that rent paid in accordance with the provisions of their lease. The danger, I guess, from a retailer and landlord's point of view is retail leasing is a cyclical business, and it's seasonal. So typically the season for retail leasing will end around October because retailers have to concentrate on their Christmas activities. If we don't get out of lockdown by the end of October, I'm talking about in New South Wales, then that's going to have implications for the leasing industry, because there will be very few deals done, if any, between now and sort of February next year. So at the moment, we're still waiting for some sort of announcement. So if we do get out of lockdown sort of by the scheduled date of August, there'll be a couple of months of leasing activity still. But if we don't, then the leasing season will probably be over until February next year. So that's just something to be aware of. I want to bring your attention to one important court case. I don't know if you remember last time I talked about the Sneaker Boy case, which is the slide after this, which basically the Sneaker Boy case went to the Supreme Court, and they found that even though the tenant was behind on rent when the pandemic hit, the landlord couldn't terminate the lease when the tenant's protection were legislated, and the lease was reinstated by the Supreme Court. So if you go back to what the most recent case, which is very confusing, and, you know, it just shows, you know, how the courts they're dealing with these issues on a case-by-case basis. The MIR Holdings case, which happened last year, November 20. So in this case, the Supreme Court refused reinstatement of a commercial lease as the tenant was already in breach prior to the lockdown. So they were already months behind in terms of their rent. And so the key points of this case are the breach. If the breach occurs before the prescribed period, the tenants are not covered under the eviction protection periods. And if a tenant was in breach prior to the current lockdown, they may not be granted relief under forfeiture. So what this means is that tenants must be aware that they still have their obligations to pay their rent. And if they were in breach prior to lockdown, that does not give them the right to protections necessarily under the current legislation. So just be aware of that. It's important. And again, if in doubt, seek legal advice. So just before I finish, I do want to just very quickly touch on a point that Brian made about, you know, where we're going with changes in omni-channel, changes in work patterns. So what I'm experiencing, particularly in my own work, is that a lot of the current thinking around particularly CBD-based retail, given that, we're looking at a permanent shift to, some sort of work at home cultural change, is there's going to be some sort of resetting of rents in line with a new sort of regime around work. So retailers are very much aware of that, but they're also very much aware that they need to diversify their income. And there's still a large debate going on in leasing circles about how that works. So landlords are obviously keen to work with their retailers. They're very well aware that they need their income, but how does the landlord and the tenant work together to actually maintain a sustainable occupancy cost ratio for both landlord and tenant? And that process is still evolving. And I think over time, you're going to see some new different business models. Last time I spoke, we talked about the Hammerson model in the UK, where the landlord and the tenant are potentially looking at sharing some of the upside and downside on rents, but also sharing on the upside and downside on online sales. So that's an ongoing debate. And next time we catch up, hopefully there'll be some more thoughts and ideas. So I hope you found that presentation useful, and I'll hand back to Anastasia.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, that was great. A really good overview. And I think everybody does want to hear what is the word on the streets. I think it's really interesting, not just to hear the legislation, but what's actually happening out there as well.
And Simon, before we pass to Joel, thank you. A really good dissertation, great summary. And I know it's a topic that's naturally high on everyone's agenda out there. So thank you. Pleasure.
Fantastic. And now we will pass to Joel Hummel, who is the director of Wheeler Grenfell Chartered Accountants, who will take us through some of the finance implications and government legislation.
Morning, Joel.
Morning. Thanks, Anastasia. Thanks, Brian. So today is a little bit New South Wales centric because obviously in lockdown, there's 3 grants offerings from the government there that have been put forward. So there's the New South Wales Business Grant, the New South Wales Job Saver, and a micro business grant. And so I'm just going to run through how much they are, the eligibility, and the online application. So on slide 2, we've got the New South Wales Business Grant. So this is the grant of up to $15,000. So it's substantial, which needs to be applied for via the New South Wales Services website. And the due date for that application is the 13th of September, 2021. So it's a cash grant for businesses that had a reduction in turnover of 30% or more during 2 consecutive weeks between the 26th of June and the 17th of July, 2021. So that's the 26th of June, 2021 and the 17th of July, 2021, compared to those same 2 weeks in 2019. So this is any 2 weeks during this period. So your 2-week period might begin on the 29th of June or the 3rd of July. It's worth running your sales figures for 2021 against 2019 and double checking this, as you might think you might only be down, say, 20% or 25%, but mathematically, when you investigate it, you may find there's a 2-week sweet spot in there where, fortunately or unfortunately, you pass. So it's relevant for slide 3 as well, because the bigger the turnover drop, the more the government grant. So it's a sliding scale. And this table just quickly summarises it. So if your turnover was down during that 2-week period you've selected, 30% or more, you receive $7.5 grand. For 50% or more, you receive $10.5 grand. And for 70% or more, you're receiving the full $15,000. On slide 4, we can see that the money is supposed to cover business expenses incurred between the 1st of June and the 17th of July 2021. So it's just a 6-7 week period there for expenses. Business expenses, they include salaries, rent, legals, marketing, and other business costs. So on slide 5, we move on to the eligibility. So the eligibility requirements include having an active ABN, of course. Your annual wages bill should be $10 million or less for the 2021 year. You've got turnover between 75,000 and 50 million for the 2020 year. And as mentioned above, having that 30% or more decline in turnover between the 26th of June 2021 to the 17th of June 2021 compared to that same period in 2019. Moving on to slide 6, we addressed the question, which was an issue for things like JobKeeper, etc., of what to do if you're a new retail business or for some other reason, this 2019 comparison compared to 2021, it's not really relevant. So Service New South Wales have confirmed that you can use a different comparison period if you can justify it. So the main justifications would be, of course, if you've got a new business or your business has been affected by, the drought, bushfires, floods, or impacted by sickness or injury. So if you've got some good reasons, then we'd recommend you, New South Wales Service New South Wales recommends you contact them to discuss it. But we're hearing about long wait times, of course, which we'd expect on their numbers. So if you just want to punch it through, we'd suggest getting your accountant to justify, explain the different comparison period you've used, and get your application in the meantime, and also chase Service New South Wales up with a phone call to alert them to your application. On slide 7, just some eligibility sticking points on this grant. You need to confirm your headcount in your application, so you need to have that ready. All businesses, including sole traders, need to confirm the business itself was the primary source of income. So the business cannot receive primarily passive income such as dividends, interest, or rent. That's, when I say primarily, that's over 50% of the income can't be passive income. So further on that point, sole traders are not eligible for this grant if they receive the COVID-19 disaster payment from Centrelink between 26th of June and the 17th of July 2021. Moving on to slide 8, to apply for the business grant, you're going to need to set up your My Service New South Wales account, declare the business meets the eligibility criteria, including those. You're going to need those turnover numbers for each 2-week comparison period that you're using. You're going to need to provide your accountant's name and phone number, and provide an Australian income tax return or other documentation, such as bank statements, to prove your turnover is between 75,000 to 50 million. If you have this information ready, the application online is reasonably straightforward. We've done quite a few of them, and it's touch wood, pretty seamless. Slide 9 has the last of the application requirements, noting that in respect of businesses that are not on the highly impacted industry list, you need a letter from your accountant confirming the downturn in turnover. But given many retail businesses are listed on the highly impacted industry list, this accountant's letter is not relevant for this business grant for those retail businesses. So I've got the highly impacted industry list. Focus on the retail sector. It's unfortunately, there's a lot of everything from clothing, florists, travel. It's all listed on there. So you won't need an accountant's letter if you're listed on that list. With slide 10, we're moving on to the JobSaver program. So it's a fortnightly payment to assist business to cover expenses incurred from 18th of July 2021 onwards. And it's the one that resembles JobKeeper the most. So slide 11 explains that JobSaver is primarily for businesses and not-for-profit organisations with employees. So the payments, they're going to be 40% of the weekly payroll for work performed in New South Wales. So the minimum payment will be $1,500 per week, and the maximum amount will be up to $100,000 per week, was announced last Thursday. So now there's something here for non-employing business as well, such as sole traders. The payment will be about $1,000 flat per week. On to slide 12, we tackle how to calculate the figure the 40% is based on, which is called the weekly payroll amount. So basically from the guidelines, we take the gross wages figure from W1 on your last BAS that you lodged. And the catch is here, the BAS needs to be a BAS for the 2021 year and had to have been lodged prior to the 26th of June 2021. Anyway, you take this BAS, you divide the W1 figure by the number of days in the BAS period to which the W1 figure relates to get your daily payroll amount, and you multiply this daily payroll amount by 7 to get the weekly payroll amount. It's this weekly payroll amount you need to put in your application. So for retailers, if you're reporting your wages monthly, retail businesses, on the BAS at W1, you're dividing the W1 figure by 30 or 31 days, depending on what was the last activity statement you lodged. Or if you're reporting wages quarterly on the BAS at W1, you're dividing the W1 figure by, say, 90 days, for example, on the March BAS. So yeah, you just need to have a look at that. It's on the New South Wales Services website under the guidelines for the grant for JobSaver. So moving on to eligibility on slide 13 for the JobSaver. The good news is that the businesses that are eligible for the business grant discussed above, they're also eligible for the JobSaver program. So you just need to apply based on those same eligibility requirements, like a current ABN, the turnover drop of 30% or more, as we discussed above, during the consecutive period from the 26th of June onwards. There's no closing date yet on that. Basically, compared to the same 2-week period in 2019, your turnover again needs to be between 75,000 and 50 million for the 30th of June 2020 year. I have some more notes on eligibility on slide 14, which is similar to those already discussed in the grant above. So I'm going to skip straight to slide 15. And that's the JobSaver program application. Again, the online application itself, it's very straightforward and similar to the JobSaver. You need your Service New South Wales account and your ABN and banking details, your accountant's name and contact details, including their tax agent number, right? So when you're doing your application, you can search for their tax agent number in the application, but I'd suggest, to save yourself time, get this from your accountant. And it's also on your tax return if you can spot it, that tax agent number. You'll need a copy of your tax return to prove your turnover, and of course, a copy of the last BAS lodge to confirm the payroll figure. Lastly, if you are not on the highly impacted list, you'll need a letter from your accountant explaining the decline in turnover of 30% or more. If you've submitted that letter to get your business grant, you don't need to submit a second letter for your JobSaver application. Slide 16 covers the need to update Service New South Wales if your headcount changes, and the closing date for the application, of course, is 18th of October 2021 for JobSaver. Slide 17, let's quickly talk about the micro business grant. So this is for small businesses with turnover between 30,000 and 75,000 who can't satisfy the turnover requirements of the JobSaver. So the amount for this grant is $1,500 paid per fortnight. Applications are again via the Service New South Wales website, and these applications close on the 18th of October 2021. Slide 18, it covers the eligibility for the micro business grant. The key point to note with this grant is you are not eligible if you have received the COVID-19, the business grant we discussed above, or the JobSaver payment. So you need to think, do I go for the JobSaver or the micro business grant? Because one may be higher than the other. So for those who have already received the business grant, unfortunately for this micro grant, at the moment, it appears you're not eligible. The same 30% decline in turnover applies for the period after, for the 2-week period after 26th of June 2021. And on that final point, we see that this grant is meant for people where the business is their primary source of income. So they're earning $45,000. If you're earning $45,000 from your business, but you're also earning $50,000 as an employee, that's going to be a barrier to this grant. We want your retail business income to be greater than any employee income you're earning for those micro business grant applications. Slide 19 notes some further restrictions, such as entities that earn primarily passive income, ineligible, as well as applying entities directly receiving the COVID disaster relief payment from Centrelink. So if you happen to be a sole trader in retail and you've received the COVID disaster relief payment Belinda ran through before, it can be, again, problematic for this application. Slide 20 covers the items you need for your application. I won't run through them again because they're very similar to the JobSaver application requirements, but they're listed there. So that's all I have today. I know, for example, Queensland, they've announced their 5,000 support grant application. It's hopefully opening next week or the week after, mid-August. And Victoria's, certainly its business cost assistance program, it's continuing, but its applications close on the 13th of August. That's just for listed industries. But at the moment, certainly for New South Wales, these applications are all open, and I implore everyone to find the time, because things are very busy even in lockdown, to try and apply or reach out for help to get your application in, to get them. Thanks, Anastasia.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joel. That was really helpful, and some ones there that potentially people didn't even realize were available. So I think that's fantastic. So a couple of questions coming in from our audience, if we can take them. So firstly, for Belinda, you covered about whether you can ask your staff if they're vaccinated. And I suppose that the point was there, you ask them, but they're not obliged to tell you. Can you confirm that that's the case? And is it permitted to exclude staff who are not vaccinated as they're a risk for other staff and customers?
That is such an incredible question, Anastasia. So thank you, whoever sent that one through. So in summary, you have to get the team members' consent to get them to provide information on their vaccination status. So obviously, if they work in a mandated industry like aged care, etc., you've got obviously more of a reason to legitimately get their vaccine status. But generally, and where I'm getting this information from is the Australian Government Office of Australian Information's Commissioner. So it's the OAIC website. And it gives you very clear parameters around what you can and can't do as it relates to the Australian privacy principles for vaccination. So what they very clearly state is that you have to have consent. So you can ask an open-ended question to your staff. We're really interested in the workplace health and safety of our customers and our team members. It'd be really great for team members to advise us, if they're comfortable to do so, of what their vaccination status is. In my experience, the majority of people will be very happy and willing to provide their vaccination status. Some may say that they're not comfortable to do that, but generally most people will provide their vaccination status. But you can't forcibly at this point in time ask someone to provide their vaccination status unless you have their consent and unless you have a highly valid reason because of, a heavy workplace health and safety requirements or some other, government requirement to get that information from them because of the Australian privacy principles. So it's a delicate balance between managing workplace health and safety obligations and then also managing the Australian privacy principles. But my recommendation practically is to ask that open-ended question. Most people, want to be good citizens. They want to be upfront and share that information. So that's generally how you get their consent to share that information. So I hope that answers the first question. And Anastasia, I think there was a second question around, if you wouldn't mind just asking that again.
Yeah, and are you allowed to exclude staff who are not vaccinated if they're a risk to other staff and customers?
Yeah, so at the moment you can't. And again, as vaccines are more readily available and as the legislation evolves on this topic, that might change in the future. At the moment, you can't. Again, I'm dealing with some of my clients on some very practical issues around risk mitigation within their workforce. So for example, within a warehouse environment, what I'm suggesting to clients is to, and excuse the word quarantine, but to have 2 groups of employees so that if, heaven forbid, you've got community transmission and workplace transmission amongst one group, that you actually have another group that's able to work. So it might be having, certain groups work certain hours on certain days and another group so that you can then at least quarantine. There's also been some questions around staff members not feeling comfortable to work with other staff members in high areas of concern, LGAs that are authorised workers. And so again, my recommendation is just to be really upfront, have transparent conversations with team members around, where other team members might be coming from, and just, make sure that they're okay to work under those situations. But generally speaking, you actually can't at this point in time, segregate people forcibly. But if you go through a consultative process where you're asking people for genuine consent to share information, if they're comfortable, that's the way to go. But at this stage, you can't forcibly get that information from them.
Thanks. Yeah, it's definitely a tricky one for the moment.
Absolutely.
Question to Joel. Sorry, Belinda.
Oh no, I was going to say what I might do is I'll send you the link, Anastasia, to share with anyone who's interested to the government website that gives you the Q&A specifically on every single vaccine scenario so that you're very comfortable and you can refer to that information so that you're not sort of flying blind. So I'll send that to you.
Fantastic. I'll share that with the links to the videos later. Question for Joel. Is the drop in turnover calculated on New South Wales stores only, or is it on the entire business?
Good question. It's aggregated business turnover, what's referred to in the guidelines. So at this moment, I'd be referring to the aggregated business turnover of the whole business.
And not just New South Wales specific.
No, not just New South Wales. The JobSaver is for the grant. There's no mention of New South Wales only, but for the JobSaver, for sure, it's based on New South Wales, work performed by employees on New South Wales. So you have to exclude, in that case, you need to exclude for JobSaver, you need to exclude the payroll costs that relate to work done in Queensland, Victoria, Perth, etc. Western Australia, etc. Yeah.
Fantastic. And another question here. There's been a retail store that wasn't opened, only recently opened in September, and has been rejected for any support and assistance. But I assume by the government, by talking to the government, is there anything else they can do?
Okay, so I'd be making sure that you've contacted the New South Wales Service New South Wales and explained the situation. My understanding is as long as you've lodged a BAS and you've got, that should be a good enough reason to get that grant. So I haven't put it to the test myself. So certainly an accountant's letter explaining it, having a period. So September, so even if you compared November, 2 weeks in November or December to the current trading in 26th of June to the 17th of July, I believe that they should be able to use their discretion and grant assistance. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to probably the New South Wales officer you get looking at your case. Yeah.
Fantastic. So worthwhile them getting us to, talking to an accountant, having their accountant's letter and getting that professional advice there, I think.
Yeah, that's right. At this stage, yeah, not certain of how where to go to from there. But yeah, I can look at it. I can look at it. And I'll send you through something, Anastasia.
Thank you. And
Yep.
One final question, because I'm just very aware that we have overrun a little bit this morning. How strict is the requirement to maintain headcount? So if you have let people go and made people redundant, even if it's only a small proportion of your workforce? Does that still rule you out from the JobSaver?
I think it might. I think it might. It's pretty. But judging by the application,
it does.
Yeah. Judging by the application criteria, it's like when you're actually on the New South Wales Services Revenue filling out the application, it's pretty clear that that's a key requirement to keep the turnover, to keep the headcount. If your headcount has dropped because someone's resigned, it's up to you to contact Services New South Wales and explain it. Obviously, if your headcount increases, it's not a problem. But if that headcount number drops, it's a problem. It's a problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, Anastasia, just jumping in there, because Joel and I spoke about this last week. Essentially, the ruling is that you have to show a maintenance of the employer and employee relationship. So if someone stood down without pay, they're still on the payroll. So then that would suffice. But if they've been terminated by reason of redundancy and let go, then that wouldn't satisfy the requirement. And as Joel said, if they've voluntarily resigned, that's no fault of the business, then you just need to notify the government of that reason and you should comply. But if you've gone and made people redundant, unfortunately, it means the eligibility won't be there.
Fantastic. So I think that answers that question pretty well there. Thank you, guys. And thank you to all of our speakers today. There's been some absolutely fantastic content, a lot of questions, because there's a lot going on at the moment. And as always, we say to everyone, if you've got any further questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can contact us via our emails or through our website, retaildoctor.com.au, or via LinkedIn to any of our panelists. And thank you for attending our 14th State of the Nation. So Brian, any final comments?
Oh, thanks, Anastasia. Well, to thank everyone, I internally call them the 18, but the content and quality of the implementation and the lessons learned. And thanks also to Natalie and Carlos. Just great coal-faced leadership, which is exactly what we require at this time. And also, we reach out to us at Retail Doctor Group for a number of reasons. Obviously, if you want to build omni-channel retail insights, but also quietly and confidentially, if you're a retailer that's doing it tough through COVID and we can help you in any way, this is the spirit of the State of the Nation. We are in this together, and it is about helping our community. So we're there for you as well. Once again, thanks everyone. Fantastic session. Anastasia, brilliant facilitation as ever. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone. Oh, by the way, one last thing. September 9, we have our next State of the Nation, and we have Anthony Hegarty, the CEO of Super Retail Group, who will be joining us. Anthony was a finalist in our ARI, Australian Retail Innovator Leadership Program. Please join us for that, because there's leadership personified, and we're looking forward to it. Thanks again to everyone.
Registrations for those events will be coming out next week, so keep a check on your emails or Retail Doctor Group LinkedIn. So if you're not following us on LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn. You'll see all the updates for our upcoming events. We've got 3 more events scheduled for the remainder of this year, with some really big speakers already booked in for each one. So keep your eyes peeled. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks everyone.